Okay, so Plato, right? A little bit of background on Plato. Um, he was one of those young aristocrats who followed Socrates around, and he was, without exception, wound up being Socrates' greatest student and chronicler as well. Um, After Socrates' death, he left Athens for Megara, sorry. Um, he spent probably about a year there, and then he was either returning to Athens or going somewhere else when he was basically abducted and sold into slavery. Right? Um, Now, slavery in the ancient world wasn't quite the same as it was in, um, you know, the United States, where there was a clear idea of like racial inferiority or superiority, depending on which way you're looking at it, involved in the um, justification of slavery. In ancient Greece, slavery, and in much of the ancient world, slavery was considered just a matter of like ill fortune, right? It was something that could happen to anyone, and it was just a bad case of fate that it happens to you. Um, and part of the reason for this idea is that it wasn't uncommon for slaves to be able to earn their freedom, right? It wasn't the sort of permanent life situation that slavery was for, like, in the United States and its history, right? People could be a slave for a very small fraction of their lives or for all of them, right? It varied. Uh, but because there was this general idea of fatalism at the core of thinking in not just Greece, but in much of the ancient world as a whole, the idea of being resigned to, your life being determined by the stars, as it were, um, and certain aspects being out of your control, it was the sort of thing that many just wound up being resigned to, right? They accepted, I don't want to say accepted, but that might be too strong of a word, but that role in their life, right? Whatever their role in life was as much by the designs of fate as it was by their own. And so, to the extent that it was the designs of fate, was no use railing against it, right? That doesn't mean you can't feel that there weren't ones, people who felt victimized by it, and justly so, like Spartacus, right? The famous rebellion led by slave revolt led by Spartacus is one clear example. But even then, the justification was that if you look at what records we have, the justification for after the fact was that it was his fate to lead the rebellion, right? It was his fate to rally against and rise above and lead the slave revolt. So it's still justified within the framework of fatalism, right? So Plato spent a number of years as a slave, between 8 and 10 years, um, as a result, and he spent most of that time as a doula, right? And nowadays we mean doula as someone who's something like a midwife, or a natural birthing coach. But a doula back then was just one who reared and educated the children, right? They were responsible for raising the children in place of the parents. Think like a live-in nanny almost, only a live-in nanny who happens to be a slave. Really fucking weird thought processes that went on back then. And I'm not trying to justify them at all. Just trying to make them a bit more comprehensible, I suppose. So he did his job when the youngest of the household turned 14, which was the age of adulthood, right? For much of ancient Greece, and he was released from his service, and he goes back to Athens and he continues writing. So it's sort of this distinction. The early dialogues are the ones that we think chronicle Socrates, that are the ones that Plato wrote that we think actually chronicle Socrates properly. Right? They are records, or as close to records as we have, of actual conversations Socrates had. The middle dialogues is where uh, he might include some of things Socrates said from previous conversations, but Socrates is acting more as a sounding board, right, for his own developing ideas. And then we have the later dialogues where Plato's ideas are in full bloom and Socrates is more or less just used as a mouthpiece, right? His teacher is more or less a mouthpiece for Plato's own ideas at this point. Now, Plato's magnum opus, right, his great work, that's just Latin for great work, meaning like the big book that he wrote, the one that he's known for, is Republic, right? It's 10 books long, right? We might consider them more or less very, very thick chapters. Each one basically being a separate part of a continuing conversation with a different focus, right? Focusing on a slightly different topic, but all of them wind up connecting up. And it's in Republic that Plato presents his metaphysics and his epistemology, and also his ethics, right? The most the most developed view of his theory of virtue is in Republic, in the later books. So Plato's worldview is a two-world view, right? His metaphysics is a two-world view, very similar to Pythagoras' two-world view of the world being divided between the intelligible, which is made of numbers, and the sensible, which is made of physical things. And it's the same sort of deal, right? You have the world of being for Plato, where the changeless, eternal things like numbers exist, right? Everything that can be known to the mind that is true regardless of time and place, that exists in the world of being. And then you have the world of becoming, the sensible world. It's very, very heavily inspired by Pythagoras. Right? And each of these worlds is further divided into two parts, right? You have the world, so within the world of being, you have the forms, which are the highest level of metaphysics that we have access to. And the forms are the individual things which share all the properties that even the rational thought of a thing has, right? So if we had horses, let's say, all the possible horses share in the form of the horse, right? And this includes all the absolutely necessary features, the necessary and sufficient features for being a horse. And then below that, we have rational objects, right? And rational objects are going to be things like the thought of a triangle, right? Like the thinking about a particular triangle. Let's say you're thinking about an acute triangle, right? An acute equilateral triangle. 3 sides, 3 interior angles, at, each of which is going to be 60 degrees, right? Now, what does the now you can also think of a scalene triangle, right? If I can, fuck it, a right triangle, right? You can think of a right triangle. And the right triangle is going to be 1 degree, interior degree of 90, and 2 interior degrees of, varying lengths, but usually it's going to be 45 and 45. And you can also think of a scalene triangle, right? One interior degree of more than 90 degrees and two other acute angles, right, of varying degrees, adding up to some number less than 90. So what do these three rational objects have in common? Well, they have in common the form of the triangle, the thing that all triangles share. They are enclosed figures. Even when you imagine them, even when you picture them in the mind, they're enclosed figures with with three sides and three interior angles adding up to 180 degrees. Right? That's the essence of the form of the triangle. So the rational object, the triangle itself, is connected with the rational idea or thoughts represented by those three facts. When you take those three facts together and you understand them to be the absolute essence of the triangle, you get perfect understanding of what a triangle is, which is equivalent, the epistemological equivalent to the metaphysical aspect of the form. Right? Now compare this in the world of becoming to physical objects. Right? If we wanted to say, take that triangle, that idea of a equilateral triangle, and draw it out, right, in the physical world, we run into an issue. The lines aren't going to be perfectly straight, right? The angles aren't going to be perfectly straight. Same, so on and so on and so on, right? But that's all rather obvious. But even if they were, there's an additional issue. That issue is you can have multiple physical objects that are exactly the same, but the fact that there's more than one of them means that they're not the same, right? So you can have a multiplicity, even more physical objects than you can the rational objects. When you picture the triangle, that equilateral triangle in your mind, no matter how many times you picture it, it is the same triangle, according to Plato. Right? It's the same triangle being pictured. But those are two distinct triangles, even if they share all the same features. Right? Now, connect this up with the idea that there are going to be individual imperfections with every physical iteration of a triangle, and you get the idea that every physical object is unique, right? And every physical object is flawed in a way that the rational objects are not. Right? And therefore, our knowledge of them can be flawed, which is why physical objects are connected up with perception, epistemologically, in Plato's Metaphysics. And then because our perception, we've all had a case where we mishear something. Misheard song lyrics are our favorite, right? But, or where we missee something. We see something as something other than what it is. Right? Perception can be fooled because of the flaws in nature, right? In the physical world. At least according to Plato, that's the case. So then, if perception's the last, the top tier of the two-tier breakdown of the world of becoming, what's the bottom tier? Right? What's below perception and physical imperfections? Well, that's going to be art and shadow, right? Imagination and opinion. Things that are reflections of the physical, that are even more imperfect. When you stand up in the sun, right? Stand up in the sun, right? Stand up under sunlight outside. You cast a shadow, right? As the day goes on, the shadow changes, right? It changes direction. You can stay in the same spot all day, right, in the same position, but the shadow changes throughout the day. It stretches, it shortens, it shifts. It has even less substance than physical objects. And so too is the case with art. Right? Art is not a representation, is not representative of reality. Right? It might be physical objects, but it is just our own flawed views, our own flawed perceptions being put into form, right? And it's subject to even more mistakes and errors. It's even more open to things like interpretation and whatnot than physical objects are. Right? Perception might be mistaken about something, but there is something that absolutely is the case for it to be mistaken about. Versus art is written to be interpreted. It's created for the purpose of being open to interpretation, which is why it aligns with imagination and opinion. With our imagination, we can take existing things and smash them together to get non-existing things. Right? We can take unicorns. We can take the idea of horns and horses and put them together and get stabby horses, aka unicorns. And we can also take the idea of wings and horses and smash them together to get pegasi, right? Of flying horses. And then we can take those two and crossbreed them in our mind to get flying stabby horses, which would have been the ultimate tactical advantage in ancient military warfare. Which is therefore proof that they did not exist, right? Because you would have crossbred unicorns and pegasi in order to have that, if they were the case, right? But what do I know, right? Okay. So, this leads us, in effect, to Plato's theory of virtue, right? So on top of this, there was what Plato called, above even the forms, there was what Plato called the good, right? Which was the point at which all the forms coalesce, right? Absolutely perfect understanding. And the good is something that we cannot know rationally. It's something that we experience viscerally, right? The good and beauty are one and the same. So, like Pythagoras, who claimed that, we need to spend life contemplating numbers to get closer and closer to them, Plato's metaphysics and his epistemology are a top-down, right? What's more real is more rational, so we need to spend more time developing the mind, according to him. That's not to say that we shouldn't indulge in like the physical or ignore it entirely, but we should dedicate ourselves to the development of the mind. And an important part of the development of the mind is going to be the development of the virtues,